About the latest news on the Central Authentication Service, otherwise known as CAS, and got quite a bit of material that I'd like to go over with you. We will focus on, in this session, a summary of achievements that have been that have become available since the last release of the Central Authentication Service. We'll focus on history, available releases, upcoming releases, changes in the client landscape, and other news that has come about in the CAS community since that. This is, in some ways, a continuation of the last presentation that was done at Apereo last year. There's a link at the bottom of that slide that pretty much attempts to cover some of the features that the previous CAS release, namely CAS 4, attempted to offer. So I would encourage you to take a look at that presentation if you need to know a little bit more about the CAS 4 release in particular, while in this presentation we'll focus on what's happened since and beyond CAS 4. So this is the quick agenda I hope to cover with you. Quick introductions first, and then we'll talk about available releases and what the CAS project is planning to basically present and release, which namely will be CAS 4.1, the next big release of the CAS software, currently in development and progress. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit about CAS Clients and the changes that have come to pass. We'll focus also a little bit on CAS integration strategies, in particular as it relates to Shibboleth and SAML and identity providers and all that good stuff. And hopefully there will be some time at the end for questions and discussions. Although if at any time you feel the urge to ask questions, please just let me know and I'll try to ignore you as best as I can. All right, so quick summary of CAS-related material and sessions of this conference. Monday, Ludwig, someone in this audience, did the CAS packaging session. Obviously today we're talking about CAS itself and the state of the project. And tomorrow at 11:45, if that hasn't changed yet, there will be a session also about multi-factor authentication with CAS, a tale of two factors. So if you're interested to learn about MFA capabilities and integrations with CAS, that would be the session I recommend for you to attend. So who am I? Ping pong. I am Misagh Moayyed. I'm a member of the project management committee of the CAS project, obviously. I'm a core committer to the project. I also am a software engineer and IAM consultant at Unicon, a company I've been with for 4 years and been with Apereo more or less for about 6 years. I actually started doing Portal and Portlet development first with Apereo and kind of got transitioned into the IAM environment, fortunately or unfortunately. Some contact info up here. If you need to reach me, that's pretty much where I live online, 24/7. If you have a question, a direct contact is always best strategy to approach me. If you do ask a question, though, and I seem to respond at some ungodly hour, please don't be alarmed. My time zone varies on a weekly basis. There are no vampires involved. So feel free to reach out. Okay, so following up on introductions, what is CAS? Describe CAS in 10 or less words. So CAS is free and open source enterprise single sign-on software for the web. Its primary mission is to provide SSO for web applications, although it has been extended to support non-browser-based authentication flows, as it were. It follows and implements an open and well-documented protocol which describes how the authentication is about to commence and what you as the client, as the service provider, should do to interact with it. And this protocol is implemented by a Java server software with, like I said, plenty of client libraries and frameworks and support around service providers to interact with the CAS server. So how do we get to use and deploy it? Well, the recommended approach to deploy CAS is by a method and strategy called a Maven WAR Overlay, which is an approach that allows you to keep your local configuration, your custom changes that would allow you to have a successful CAS deployment in conjunction with what the stock default CAS distribution offers. So when the Maven WAR Overlay process goes to execute the entire build, it'll see that you have some changes that describe your particular needs for CAS, and it will merge those with whatever the stock CAS distribution offers, and finally you get a web application that you can deploy. So it allows you to keep your changes at a minimum, trackable, hopefully in some sort of local source control that you can manage. And one of the biggest probably advantages of this overlay process is that it really facilitates the upgrading process. If you're on CAS 3.5.1 and you simply wish to upgrade to CAS 3.5.2 or whatever the next available release is, all you really have to do is go to the configuration, bump that version up to 3.5.2, press build or whatever it is, and the process will magically simply just download the required software and run it. There's no need to rebuild the software from source and go through all that hassle. There is a link, simple CAS 4 overlay template up on this slide that basically serves as a starter, a quick start for you to get started with the deployment and see how a Maven overlay process is structured and some of the other tricks that we actually do in terms of best practices when it comes to deploying CAS. Okay, so moving on to CAS releases. Currently, what's available are two CAS releases, primarily for CAS 3.5 and CAS 4. For 3.5, the latest available release is 3.5.3. For CAS 4, the latest available is 4.0.1. So these are primarily, as probably the version number suggests, these are primarily patch releases, security releases that the CAS project has made available. There are some upcoming releases as well. Again, security and patch releases for CAS 3.5. The subsequent version would be CAS 3.6. And likewise, for the CAS 4 release line, the upcoming available release would be 4.0.2. Again, mostly around security improvements, some internationalization bug fixes, OpenID OAuth improvements. One question I think I've been asked oftenly is why there's no CAS 3.5.4. Why is it a 3.6? And the reason that is because this proxy authentication configuration bug fix that was reported to the CAS project, its fix required an API change, which prompted us to bump the release version to 3.6. If you've extended the CAS software to the point where that might become an annoyance, you might experience some pain when you do an upgrade, but chances of that happening are just basically slim to none. And if you've done some extension like that, I'd very much like to know about it, because you're not supposed to really to that level. So just come see me. All right, so CAS 3.6 and 4.0.2, these are upcoming releases. We've done all the legwork that we can on these two releases, and I think there's only one small little item that we need to do before we cut the releases. So hopefully within the next week or so, these two releases will become available for you to upgrade. The upgrade process, again, should be completely smooth with no pain, unless you've done some radical stuff. And through the Maven overlay process, you can just bump the version and move on. All right, so any questions so far? All right. So moving on to CAS 4.1. This is in some ways, the next big CAS release that has been in development since May 2014. So about a week and a year. It's been in development since last year, this conference, basically. It features a very large set of changes, north of 130 issues, pull requests resolved, and that number probably has grown since I put together this slide. It's probably 150 now. I think I was looking at it last night. So large set of changes and improvements. In some ways, this may have been CAS 5, really, as the scope sort of crept beyond what we originally intended to do, but we managed to keep the feature set in some way that we would not break backwards compatibility. So we kept it at 4.1, as much backwards compatibility, I should say. We haven't been completely adhering to the release strategy. But nonetheless, so CAS 4.1, 130 issues, requests resolved. The CAS project on a nightly basis publishes snapshot releases of the code base. So every change that we make within an hour or so, it'll be available for you to try out through this 4.1.0 snapshot releases in your Maven overlay. So you can always try out to see what the heck is the CAS project up to and how you can take advantage of it almost immediately. The snapshot releases, I've been asked this often, the snapshot releases are completely stable. The code always compiles, deploys, and runs fine. There's nothing unstable about it per se. It's just that it will just continually keep updating itself. But it should run perfectly fine. The documentation for the project likewise will be available at that link. If I go over there, or attempt to do that, just a quick show of where the documentation will be. Can everybody see the screen? Nope. Anyway, I'll try to show you later. But the documentation will be available at that link. The documentation also has been kept up to date as the development has progressed. It was not the process of write the code first and then write the docs later. Everything happened concurrently. So if you want to see something about a particular feature the CAS 4.1 offers, the docs should be available immediately to you. And everything on the documentation page, as far as the project's concerned, is correct and accurate and should work. If you find something that doesn't, please let us know. We'll go figure out and probably fix it. Okay, so more on CAS 4.1. So as I mentioned, it features a very large set of changes, and I have almost 3 slides here, and it's just really non-comprehensive of all the stuff that CAS 4.1 offers, and there's many, many more. So I don't certainly intend to walk through all these features with you. It's just going to be exhausting, and frankly, as middleware software is, it's sometimes impossible to show other than it works. But I do have some demos that I'd like to show some of the features, at least from a user interface perspective, and some of the protocol-related changes that I think would be especially helpful for you. So I'll just take a quick glance and see some of the things that you might find interesting. The CAS Management web app is in the process of a complete rewrite or revamp. I'll show you screenshots of that. There was a bug that the CAS login screen simply flashed back at you if it stayed idle for a while. That has been fixed. The ability to fetch CRLs from LDAP, requiring services for authentication as opposed to just keeping them optional. Updates to metrics, statistics, configurations, OpenID Connect support as a service provider and not as an identity provider. I think that's important to mention. What else? SSO sessions report, OpenSAML support, password and proxy attributes in the CAS response, JSON service registry, role-based service authorization, OAuth improvements. What else? Caching of principal attributes, ability to define a logo, a logout URL, or single logout on a per application basis. Spinego client selection strategies, I think Sean greatly helped out with, and many, many other improvements. So without kind of trying to bore you to death, let me just quickly demo some of the things that I think would be useful for you. And as always, if there is anything that you feel like it's missing, or if you have a question about a feature that's not listed on these slides, and probably there is one that isn't, let me know, and I will try to answer your question as I can. Okay, so let's see if I can switch over to my, here we go. All right, so how do we plan to progress through this demo? Okay, so first thing I mentioned is let's talk a little bit about auditing and basically general CAS infrastructure. So you notice that, I hope the font is big enough. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Where are we? Oh, maybe not. All right, so I'm running CAS 4.1 on Java 8. You can certainly do so. Java 8 is certainly supported. When you spin up the CAS process, let me actually do that once so you could see what the heck goes on. And, oops. All right. So as you spin up CAS, and it comes up, some of the improvements that have been put into the login configuration is it attempts to report back on the CAS server version itself, the Java version it supports, the runtime that it supports. Sometimes we get questions like, I don't know what CAS server we actually use. How do I find out? And this would be an easy way for you to kind of take a look at the logs and see what Java runtime does the CAS software run on, and what version of the CAS software you've actually deployed, and so on and so forth. All right. What else can I show you? So the CAS project now has the ability to require services for authentication, meaning as optionally, of course. So before, you could simply just go to a CAS login URL, and it would simply just present you with a generic login box. You log in, and it will come back and say, hey, thank you, you logged in successfully. We've taken that ability away so that if you simply just go there, it will ask you, sorry, you're not allowed to come here. You need to be going somewhere. If you don't have a need for a generic authentication prompt, this would be something that you could take advantage of. Let's see. So in an attempt to go into a CAS application, let me log in once. Here's an application, a sample application that I plan to get to. And it tells me that your application is not authorized to use CAS. The account that I'm actually trying to log into lacks privileges that are required by the CAS server to go. This is a showcase of role-based service authorization with CAS. If I go to my configuration for this app, somewhere in here, oops, if I can find it here, see if I can find it. Web apps, CAS, WebINev, classes. So I was trying to go into my sample 2 application. And if I take a look at the registry for that application, it says that my access strategy is that you can only access this particular application if you have an attribute called CN, whose value is Misagh, and if there is another attribute called member of, whose value is awesome. So I need to be with a common name of Misagh, and I need to be a member of the awesome group. Since I don't have that, CAS will simply stop me from going to that application. You can simply configure this on an attribute basis. Access strategy is to a given application. Coincidentally, this is the JSON service registry that CAS now ships by default. It features the service registry model and the service model in CAS, and especially in CAS 4 and 4.1, has changed quite a bit. And so this service registry model allows you to take complete advantage of everything that the CAS software actually provides. You can still do things in XML if you like, but one cool ability here is these service registry definition files, they're automatically reloaded by CAS. So as you make changes will be automatically recognized by the CAS software. So there's no need to redeploy, restart, or anything like that. For instance, let's see if I can actually do this. If I take out this particular piece in here and say I have no access strategy, and I attempt to go into my CAS 2 app, attempt to re-authenticate again, and I am now in. Internet willing. Here we go. So changes automatically being reloaded by CAS in the JSON service registry. Now let's go over to another application here. I've got a CAS 1 application that I'd like to demo for you. What's particular about this application is the CAS project has the ability to assert proxy granting tickets and the user's credential in its validation response. Previously, you had to do something with ClearPass, or you had to get the proxy ticket and call CAS and get a proxy granting ticket, and this whole thing just became sometimes very, very difficult if you had multi-node clustered CAS deployments. It just got out of hand. So the CAS project has now started to support a credential and a proxy granting ticket attribute in the validation response that it encrypts and passes back to you, and you as the client application are responsible for decrypting it and figure out, hey, here's my proxy granting ticket, now I can do XYZ with it, or here's the user's credential, and now I can talk to Outlook Web Access, or whatever happens to be. So that is sort of important to know. In terms of user interface changes, the CAS project now, see if I can go over to here. All right, so statistics of the CAS software, auditing, performance logs, all of that has been greatly improved. The statistics endpoint now features some additional links down here that allows you to take a look at the CAS metrics in terms of its runtime configuration, take a look at the thread dump that basically tells you what the CAS software is actually doing while it's running and what threads are active. If you run into some out-of-memory problem, this would be helpful to take a look. There is an SSO sessions report that previously simply existed as an extension around the CAS software that's now available here. You can take a look. There is also an internal configuration report that tells you the runtime configuration of the CAS software. All the stuff that you've put into the XML files are displayed here back to you so that you can take a look and see what the CAS project is actually, what the CAS server is actually doing. In addition to the configuration, all the CAS properties are also displayed on this page, right? So if I wanted to see what, who has access to the statistics or the status endpoint, I'll simply just come in here and I'll search for status. And it says, oh, you've got a property that says, the status endpoint is protected by nothing, pretty much. Permit all. Everybody's allowed to come in here, which is why Misagh was able to get here without being asked for authentication. So there is this internal configuration report that you can figure out what properties you've enabled with CAS, whether you have SLO enabled or not. Any property that you previously had in the CAS properties file simply would just show up here automatically. Few of the things. The CAS project, as part of its security best practices, has started to obfuscate sensitive data in the logs. So you'll basically no longer get the full ticket granting ticket ID in the logs or the proxy granting ticket ID in the logs. You basically just get, hey, this happened, right? Everything still functions fine. You just won't get to see it, as we consider TGTs and PGTs somewhat sensitive. Same thing with the ticket granting cookie. If I attempt to search, I guess I need to refresh. See if I can refresh here. Here we go. If I take a look at my TGC, my ticket granting cookie that represents the single sign-on session, you will no longer see the TGT ID in here. It's an obfuscated, encrypted, and signed value that the CAS server only knows and will unsign, it will unencrypt or decrypt and attempt to verify. So there's no chance of sniffing the cookie or replaying it back and so on and so forth. So that's also another change that the CAS project has taken, along many, many, many others. Any questions so far before I jump back into the slides? Like I said, the feature set is very large. It's sort of impossible to go over every single one of them. But the proxy granting ticket attribute in the validation response, the credential in the validation response, the auditing, logging, all those types of things are performant. Yes, Will?
So, Misagh, I'm glad to see the security improvement in terms of protecting the sensitive data in the logs. Use case we have yet is sometimes we get requests to turn down access to users. Right now, we have a facility where we would go to the log, find the ID, and then do a custom script we've written, get ahead and close that.
Sure.
So is there a feature or mechanism to do that now that the TTs aren't in the log?
That they show up unobfuscated, basically, so that you can scan them?
Please repeat the question.
If I had the user ID, that I could make sure that they don't have a valid, or I could close off or sign them out of a TGT.
There is a way that you can actually get a hold of the TGT. So everything that I'm showing here is completely optional and configurable. But while by default it shows up like that, you can certainly make it to not show up like that. That's certainly available. But the ability for you to sign a user out administratively, I don't think there is a way to do that. No, it depends on your ticket registry backend, basically. If it's something that supports persistence, you can simply just go to the backend. You'll find a TGT ID in there for that particular user. You'll invalidate it, remove that record, and when CAS comes back alive, it says, "Oh, I don't know that TGT for you. Bye-bye," and you've signed out.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I like the improvement from the security posture, and I'm not
So the question is really more, is this a valid feature and maybe something we should think about adding rather than
Oh, I see.
looking for a workaround? But thank
Okay,
you.
sure. Yeah, certainly. Could certainly think about it. Okay, any other questions? All right. So moving on to the remainder of the slides, let's talk a little bit about CAS Client. So the most significant change in the client space so far is an update to the Java CAS Client library. 3.4 basically is going to be the next version, which, there are two big features in the CAS Client 3.4 release that I think would be very useful to know about. One is the client will support talking to the P3 service validate endpoint, which is a new endpoint in the CAS protocol that allows you to consume user attributes. This became available in CAS 4, and now the Java CAS Client has the ability to support consuming user attributes directly in the CAS protocol, not via SAML 1 as it used to be the case. Also, the client will feature a different way to configure properties in its settings. So previously, you either had settings in the web.xml file or in some sort of JNDI file or some sort of elaborate container configuration that allowed you to specify the server name, the CAS login URL, and all that stuff. The project now allows you to additionally specify the client application's settings and configuration in an external property file. So in the web.xml, you'll simply go in and say, my configuration strategy is a property file, and here's where the property file is going to be. And the property file name is by default that. If you don't specify it, it'll attempt to look for that file. So we're trying to keep the configuration at a very minimal level. So yes, ability to consume attributes, the ability to configure a client from a variety of places and strategies. The open SAML dependency now will become optional. This generally presented problems where you had to bundle the client with an application that relied on a bunch of other jars and other dependencies, and there were just so many conflicts that the project decided to make the dependency optional and use other mechanisms for dealing with SAML-related functionality. So that has also been improved, along with other bug fixes and improvements and so on. Okay, moving on to CAS and Shibboleth. So some exciting news in the Shibboleth community. The identity provider now has support for CAS protocol. This is the strategy where you actually authenticate via the identity provider, but then talk to applications that are protected by a CAS client. So the authentication, nonetheless, is happening and is taken care of by the identity provider. You're just talking to clients through a CAS protocol mechanism. The configuration is enabled per relying party or per application per se. If you enable it for the default relying party, then obviously you've enabled it for all applications that are going to take advantage of the identity provider. And much like the CAS server itself, the CAS support in the Shibboleth Identity Provider has a service registry equivalent that you get to register applications through a URL with a pattern and so on and so forth. But everything else, in terms of attribute release and all that sort of thing, is handled by the identity provider itself in the usual way that it does attribute release and resolution. Nothing different about that. It's only the service registry analog that attempts to provide a SAML-like metadata for CAS support in the identity provider. Then there is the Shib-CAS Authenticator v3. This is the reverse of the previous situation. This is where you actually get to delegate authentication requests from a Shibboleth identity provider to an external CAS server. So when an authentication request comes to the identity provider, that gets moved over to CAS. You authenticate with CAS. You come back to the identity provider, and the flow resumes back normally, passing back the SAML response to the application. And this is handled all by this Shib-CAS Authenticator v3 that is compatible with the identity provider 3 release line, whatever that happens to be, 3.0, 3.1, what have you. In the Identity Provider v3, authentication, the authentication subsystem is heavily dependent on various flows that commence throughout the authentication dance. So the CAS external authentication is just another authentication subflow that you'll need to enable in your identity provider. You'll put the configuration normally in the IDP properties file, which is the default place to put configuration items for the identity provider. And off you go. The project's available on GitHub under Shib-CAS Authn 3. It's publicly available. And you're welcome to try it out. Tell us a bit more about it if you ran into any issues. Yes, Bill? Yeah. No worries. So what was the question? What do you have in mind?
It supports the IDP v3.
Yes, it does. Yes. 3.0, 3.1, and potentially 3.2. I hope so. Okay, so you can authenticate via Shibboleth Identity Provider, enable CAS protocol support, and talk CAS to the clients, or you can have authentication requests delegated to a CAS server and talk to applications via SAML. So what would be the integration patterns? Do we need a Shibboleth Identity Provider? Do we need a CAS server? Do we get to authenticate with CAS? Do we get to authenticate with the IDP? How are we going to handle protocol support for various applications that we have? And so on and so forth. And these are questions that you carefully need to evaluate and see what meets the best criteria for achieving single sign-on and federated authentication. It really, I think it really just comes down to use cases you want to satisfy, features you want to implement and consider, and finally figure out how this mix or this match or this marriage can actually work for you in whichever direction that would satisfy your use cases. But these are the available options that you can either leverage CAS protocol support in the IDP or delegate authentication request to a CAS server from the identity provider, or actually do them both. There's nothing stopping you from doing them both. It would be sort of crazy, but it certainly can happen. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about CAS Extensions. These are add-ons, sort of one-off projects and plugins that have become available in the CAS community that allow you to do things that normally the CAS server project itself does not, or does not yet, I should say. And so some of these extensions are, the list is a lot larger and longer than this, but some of the extensions are the ability to have CAS to act as a SAML SP, which would be that it's kind of the reverse of the situation I just described for you. Authentications are passed along from the CAS server to an external Shibboleth identity provider, or a SAML identity provider, I should say. And CAS simply in between acts as a proxy to take that SAML response that comes back from that external identity provider and translates it into something that CAS clients can understand via the normal CAS protocol. So CAS SAML auth is at that link up on GitHub. It does support CAS 3.5, I believe. I'm not sure if it still supports or if there are any plans to support CAS for it, but likely those will be taken into consideration as well. There is the ability to also configure an application. If you happen to be writing a Java web app, and you want that application to be protected by the Java CAS client rather than doing everything in web.xml or configuration files and so on. There is the extension here that allows you to, through Java, auto-configure your application so that none of that configuration, for the most part, in the XML and in configuration files would be necessary. This all happens automatically if you're a Java developer via annotations and so on that enables CAS protection for your application sort of automatically. And then finally, Unicon had a project called CAS Add-ons, which basically featured a very large set of extensions that allow you to do a lot of cool stuff with the CAS server. Since, I think, release 1.11 or something, we realized that the project, the CAS Add-ons project, had become too large and too monolithic, and it was just sort of becoming impossible to manage all the dependencies, various modules, all those extensions. So we broke it apart. and we moved it over to a Unicon CAS add-ons namespace, where all those features and extensions that were previously bundled in one big jar, they're now broken apart into micro, small services that you get to pick and choose from. So if you're interested in a YAML service registry, there is one particular service you can actually include in your CAS overlay. If you want to do auto hostname generation for a multi-node deployment, certainly there is one that you can just pick rather than having one giant CAS add-ons jar available in your deployment. Okay, so CAS Next Gen. Let's talk a little bit about what else is in store for the CAS project and what we might think about in the future in terms of its development and roadmap. So we are talking about it. Roadmap's under development. Some of the things that have been discussed on mailing lists and in conferences and in talking to other developers and the user base and so on are the things that I've listed up here. This is in no way a comprehensive list or a list that we 100% commit to doing for the next CAS release. It's just stuff that it's under the radar, and it's stuff that we're considering and have the bandwidth and the manpower to actually get to. So SAML SP support, I mentioned there is an extension that allows you to have CAS act as a SAML SP proxy. Well, we're considering whether CAS should do that by default automatically. Multi-factor authentication support, CAS 4 started to do the ground-up work for supporting multi-factor authentication use cases, and we'd like to extend that to actually build that into the product through an external provider like Duo Security, Twofer, and so on, and allow people to actually utilize that feature rather than having them write the code that would enable that feature. ADFS support is something we're also thinking about. We actually have written, John Gasper, my colleague, actually has a module that allows CAS and ADFS to work in harmony. CAS acting as an ADFS proxy, delegating authentication requests to an ADFS identity provider. So that's something we're considering to also include in the CAS server by default. OAuth redesign, front channel logout support, which appears to be experimental still at this point, but we plan to improve upon it a bit more. Java 8 support is something we might get around to, and certainly an SSO management redesign. There are a number of use cases, and especially if we were going to enable support for multi-factor authentication, this cannot be achieved unless we take a hard look at the code base and clean up some of those rough edges that would not allow us to do MFA as cleanly as we would like them to do. So this probably be a major refactoring, a somewhat major refactoring of the code base to make sure that we decouple and clean up the code base as much as possible to get to some of these other additional features and use cases we'd like to do. So for further discussions and ideas, please join the CAS Dev mailing list. This would be the place to talk about features you're interested in, things you'd like to develop. If you have any contributions you'd like the CAS project to take a look at, or those be included in the default distribution, this would be the mailing list to join. And as always, if you come across a security issue, a security feature you'd like to see in CAS, like Bill mentioned one here, and other security-related items, the Application Security Working Group would be the place to, likewise, as a mailing list you can join to contribute ideas, report bugs in a private, sensitive manner, and have the CAS project respond to them. Okay, how am I doing on time, actually? It's 10:45, right? I think about 5-6 minutes? Yeah, okay. So, any questions, comments, ideas, suggestions? I think we have about 5 minutes or so. It's difficult to see everybody from up here. Bill.
So this afternoon via the schedule is a little light on identity and access management track, and I was wondering if folks were available and interested, perhaps getting together in the collaboration room to think about kind of the future of CAS, sort of new features or features that people have built, kind of an open discussion about getting more in the nuts and bolts of the project kind of going forward. I know there's a number of features and extensions that Lafayette's interested in seeing evolve and added to the code base, and they're not on that list that you had there, so I'm interested to get other people's thoughts, but I'm also interested to hear what other people are thinking about kind of near-term feature additions. So I don't know if, so maybe by show of hands, are folks interested in getting together maybe later after lunch? So maybe 1:30 or so in the collaboration room, which is over in the
All the way
hallway.
on the left-hand side of the building.
Try that.
Sure, sounds good. Anything else? All right. Mark. Yes, absolutely. I forgot to mention the slides will be available immediately after this presentation up online here. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending. I hope to see you around.